in that 5th chapter of 2 Samuel, the 17th to the 25th verses, there is the story of the defeat of the Philistines at the hands of David. There were 2 encounters. The first, which describes what happened when he heard that they had come in search of them. David inquired of the Lord just what would happen, and he was given the assurance that he would be victorious over them. Their defeat was so complete that they not only retreated themselves, but they left all their gods and their idols behind. The second was, of course, when they came nigh to Jerusalem, and David again asked God for guidance. And the word came to him this time that he should go around to the rear of the enemy's army, and he should wait opposite a clump of mulberry trees. And when he heard the sound of marching in the top of the trees, he should attack, because he could be sure that the Lord was going before him. When thou hearest the sound of a going in the tops of the mulberry trees, then thou shalt bestir thyself. We do not know just what kind of tree this was. We do know that they were not mulberry, because that variety was not introduced into Palestine until after Old Testament days. They probably were balsam or poplar trees, the kind of trees that the slightest motion in the air would make the leaves to whisper. For the purpose of this sermon, however, the type of tree doesn't really matter. So I'm using the one that is given to us in the King James Version, using it principally because of the symbolism of it. How often it is that God speaks through some symbolic mulberry tree and gives to us our marching orders. It happened to Moses on Mount Horeb, when he saw the burning bush that was not consumed. It happened again when he went up to Mount Sinai, and there the commandments were given to him. It happened to Isaiah when he went up to the temple in the year that King Uzziah died, and there he saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his train filling the temple. And he heard the words to asking, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? It happened to St. Paul when he was walking on the road to Damascus. It happened on that great day of Pentecost when they were all with one accord in one place, and suddenly there came from heaven as a rushing mighty wind, and it filled all the place where they were sitting. One thing all these had in common, and that was the recognition that God was speaking to them and that he was giving to them their marching orders. When thou hearest the sound of going in the tops of the mulberry trees, then shalt thou bestir thyself. Well, there are many sounds of going today, and some of them are extremely frightening. In that sense, we have much in common with those early people of Israel. There were noises that night that spoke not of the nearness of God, but of the proximity of the enemy. There were tensions. There were threats. There were dangers in the air. And some of them must fairly have screeched at them. Trouble was just that close, and so it is with us. Bishop Kennedy tells about a man who was having breakfast in the Kennedy International Airport in New York. A Cuban came into the coffee shop and he waved a beer bottle and he began to tell the people about Cuba and to say that America, above all things, must not ignore what was happening there. One of the waitresses listened very patiently for a time, and then she said, "Listen, mister, this is a place of business, and we don't want any trouble, so get out." And without a word, very dejectedly, and with a very rejected look, the man took his beer bottle and left. And nearly every person in that coffee shop turned to the finishing of his breakfast, all excepting one. This, an American sailor. And he sat looking at his coffee cup for a few moments. And then he called that waitress over to him. And he said, "Listen, lady, you made a mistake. That Cuban wasn't trying to cause you any trouble. He was simply trying to tell you that you got trouble." Now, there's a lot in that story. So many things that are happening we just can't sweep under the rug. So many things we can't get rid of them by simply saying, "Look, mister, this is a place of business. We don't want any trouble, so get out. Leave us alone." This world just doesn't leave people alone. They either become a part of the challenge, they either become a part of what's happening up there in the mulberry trees, or they'll be flattened by it sooner or later. How easy it would be if you could just say, "We don't want any trouble, so get out." That Cuban represented a problem for America, and because he represented a problem for America, he represented a problem for every community in America, and he represents a problem for every one of us, because no man is an island. Every person's a part of the main. And we got trouble. Cuba is just one of them. The war in Vietnam is another. The nervous state of the Middle East is another. All indicating how difficult it is for people to live together in peace, and how difficult it is to get nations to outlaw the deadly folly of war. The world knows that it doesn't dare let the Third World War start, and yet it continues to play with matches around the powder kegs. We got trouble. These United States last summer, city after city filled with bloody riots, as people cried for justice. And when it was all over, instead of the feeling that problems had been solved, there was the threat that this was only the beginning. And that probably the threat of black power might take the place of the previous goal of integration. We got trouble. Tremendous work needs to be done in the slums and in the inner city. hospitals, schools, colleges, universities, because of inflation and the need for expansion and other causes, they find themselves very much pressed for the need for funds. And yet they can't get those funds because we happen to be living in a day when it seems to be essential that we spend billions of dollars for instruments of death that are out of date even before they leave the drawing table. Because we seem to feel that it's tremendously important to stick a needle in the tired old moon. We got trouble. All the time, families are falling apart and moral standards are being trampled almost beyond recognition. And at a time when the church is needed, probably more than it ever was before, it's struggling for its life. Surely the greatest danger that's facing the world is not the Vietnam War or the threat that's in the Middle East, but in the creeping erosion of moral and spiritual values in these United States of America. I read of a manufacturer of asbestos who built his home right across from the minister's. And they sooner moved in than he began to spend his life in very riotous living, and he never went to church. The minister was a very kindly person, not as vocal as some of the rest of us. He just didn't like to say a word against anyone. But finally he said to his wife, "It seems to me they're putting a great deal of faith in their asbestos." Well, some of them are going to a place where I don't think it's going to help them much. But we've a world that's been drifting more and more to that kind of faith, and it's frightening. We got trouble. And sometimes the shout of it, the screech of it is so violent, it's so loud, that you can scarcely hear that sound in the mulberry tree. But the sound's there, thank God. The sound is there that reminds us that not only is there an enemy waiting to attack, but there also are some things there that are going for us. I believe that one of the most important is the church that's trying to be relevant to the problems we face. I know it has been criticized. I know the church has been criticized for going into areas where some church members felt that it ought not to have gone. But I know personally a goodly number of the leaders of the church of all faiths. And I know that they sincerely believe that they are doing what they believe is right. More than that, you can't expect of men. And there's something else that history says about the church. For years, it has been accused of being pink because of certain recommendations in the social area. But as the decades have gone by, have you noticed that more and more the recommendations that the church made years ago have been becoming a part of the laws of the land? And in spite of the criticism, I believe that Henry Pitney Van Dusen was right when he said, with all its divisions, its inadequacies, its apostasies, the world Christian movement today is the greatest power for the uplifting of humanity. It's the greatest power because it's sincerely trying to be a channel of the gospel. Not because of what it is itself, but because of the foundation on which it stands and the gospel it's attempting to preach. And because we know that every time that civilization has turned against that, you have the same description of things that you find back in the book of Genesis, where it says it was without form and void, and there was darkness on the face of the earth. And I believe, in spite of all the crepe hanging, the church has an opportunity today that has seldom been surpassed in history. I believe it because I believe that the world has been trying a lot of other things and it has been turning away from them, hungry and seeking. A couple of weeks ago, we quoted from Dr. Gordon's book, Through the Valley of the Kwai. He was, you recall, describing what happened in a Japanese prison camp. Conditions were horrible. It was difficult for the men to escape utter degradation. And he said one day an Australian sergeant came to him who had something on his mind that took him a little time to get it off. He didn't speak very good English, but he got his point over. He said, "Padre, we're fed up with all we see around here. No, sir, it ain't good any way you look at it. It's rotten, rotten, rotten. My cobbers and I have given this a lot of thought. We've seen the worst there is, right? Now we feel that there must be something better somewhere. So if you please, we'd like to have another go at this Christianity." And if you read the book, you remember that in some miraculous way, the Spirit of Christ got into that camp. And they stopped stealing from one another, they stopped stealing from the living, and they stopped stealing from the dead. And Gordon said, maybe there's milk and honey of the Spirit that puts hope into a man's eyes and a song on his lips. I believe there's a sound in the mulberry trees, if you will, which says that with all the things that are being tried by both youth and the elders of today, there's a hunger in the heart of man for that hope and for that song. And as the years go on, instead of it diminishing, it's getting louder. Christopher Morley one day was idly looking at the telephone, and he found himself thinking of the people who were out there somewhere just wishing that the phone might ring. There was the mother whose son had been away from home for a long time and she hadn't heard from him. There's the lonely person in the city who just wants the phone to ring from somebody, from anybody. There are all those young girls out there who wonder if that young man is ever going to phone and ask them to dinner. And he said he found himself wishing that he could just call them all and give some good news to each. A kind of dial-up prayer idea. If he could just somehow get into all the needs and all the loneliness and all the hunger and all the seeking that's away out there. If we could only do it as a church. Our United Presbyterian Church is trying to do a little. When you look at some of the statistics, they look somewhat imposing. Overseas, we have 273 elementary schools, we have 29 colleges, we have 327 missionary teachers, we have 15,426 national teachers, we have over 346,000 students, we have 54 missionary doctors, we have 931 national doctors related to the church, we have over 1 million in and out patients. We have in this country day schools and colleges and missionaries. We have 22 seminaries in foreign lands. We have 7 missionaries and seminaries in our own lands. But the tragedy is that we haven't had enough money even to stand still. That's the tragedy. Do you know that today in New York, we have 80 areas that are just hungry for hospitals, schools, church in our foreign work alone. We have 67 young people, fully qualified, fully trained to go into that work. Do you know how many we can afford to send this year? 37. And the rest will have to do something else this year. There's been a sound in the mulberry trees and we've had to ignore it. There's a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the flood, leads on, but also omitted all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and misery. As a church, we've been missing a great many times. So, this year we're going to have to ask you for an increase. Oh, you knew I was going to get around to it. You knew that sooner or later one gets to the last of the sermon for which the first is made. But one couldn't sleep with his conscience today if he didn't do it. And although we're not asking the members of the radio congregation to help support this church, we are asking the members of the radio congregation to help to support this radio ministry and also to help support the benevolences of this church. For our own congregation, what a generous job you did with the 50 million fund, and what great things are being done all over the world because of your generosity. We didn't ask you for an increase in our budget last year because of that fund, but we can't go on sparing you for 2 years in a row, not with the problem of inflation and the problems of rising cost. I hope you had a happy holiday, but it's over. Think about it prayerfully. And remember what Clement said one time, let us not merely seem to believe and pay attention while we are being exhorted by the elders, but also when we've gone home, let us remember the commandments of the Lord. When you go home, think about this, talk about it. It's said that a group of businessmen in London went to pay their respects to one of their number that had died. They knew that he was in very bad financial straits when he died. And so one of them went around to each and every mourner, and he said, "I'm sorry, 20 pounds. How sorry are you?" Something of the same procedure is followed in the weddings in Greece. Guests pin money on the bride. Isn't that a lovely practice? Came too late for me for it to do any good. But they pinned money on the bride, and they would put a little note like this: "I'm happy, $10. How happy are you?" How sorry are you about the state of the world? How happy are you that we've got the privilege of at least helping in a little way to do something about it? There's no mistaking the sound of marching in the mulberry trees. It's time to move forward. Therefore thou shalt bestir thyself, for then shall the Lord go out before you. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.